Hi students, this week we're looking at content from Chapter 11 on experiments and confounding variables. We'll look at threats to internal validity. Remember, internal validity has to do with our ability to say that our independent variable, what we manipulated, actually made a difference when it came to changes in our dependent variable, and it was not something else. We'll also be interrogating null effects. So let's say we do a study, and at the end of the study, it looks like our independent variable did not impact our dependent variable. Could something else be going on? So first, in terms of internal validity, we're looking at, did the independent variable really cause a difference? We will explore a pretest post-test design, a one group pretest post-test design, and we'll use this example. The book calls it a really bad experiment, and it's true, but it helps us to see several places where internal validity may be impacting what's going on within our study. We will look at three potential internal validity threats that impact any experiment as well. So here is the one group pretest post-test design. It's called the really bad experiment, and there's several examples of this in the book. I want to use some of these examples to illustrate internal validity challenges within research. So we have somebody who works within a camp setting, and the researcher believes that the rowdy or rambunctious behavior of the campers has something to do with sugar consumption. So they get the campers, they measure their rowdy behavior. Now, of course, there would need to be a good operational definition of what is rowdy behavior. What does that look like? How does that get measured? But they get measured in terms of their rowdy behavior. They are their sugar is reduced for a week. And then at the end of the week, their rowdy behavior is measured again. And this is called the one group pretest post-test design, right? Because there's just one group of campers. They are measured on as a pretest in terms of their rowdy behavior. The sugar is reduced and then they're measured again as a post-test. And as we see, it's graphed out here on our x-axis. We have what they're at the beginning of the week, we have at the end of the week, and then on the y-axis, we have some measure of their rambunctious behavior. Again, we're not sure what it is. And then if we reduce their sugar, we see that there are changes from pretest to post-test. As another example, let's say a clinician believes that some measure of or some cognitive therapy is going to influence depression in women that are experiencing depression. So they gather a group of women who are experiencing depression. They measure their depression at the beginning, and again, there must be some standardized way to do that, perhaps with the Beck Depression Inventory Scale. The women engage in some kind of cognitive therapy. And again, we'd have to have that operationalized. What exactly did that mean for this study? And then their depression is measured again after some period of time. And we've got on our graph right here, pre-therapy, post-therapy in terms of and then we've got their depression scores. And we're looking to see if the cognitive therapy that happened before therapy and then after therapy, that cognitive therapy influenced their depression scores. So here's the basic design. We have a group of participants. We measure them on some dependent variable, whether it's rambunctious behavior or depression. They receive a treatment, and then they have a post-test. Now, it's called a one group design, but here's the thing, and you may be thinking about this. Is this a within groups design or is it a between groups design? Well, let's consider that. Remember, as a within groups design, this has some characteristics of a within groups design. It kind of looks like a repeated measures kind of a study because we have a pretest and we have a post-test. So remember the example we talked about in earlier discussions where participants came in and they were exposed to chocolate. They had to actually taste some chocolate and rate the chocolate. It kind of looks like the repeated measures design where they might rate the chocolate, then they would taste the chocolate with a confederate and rate the chocolate again. But if you're remembering correctly, there's a component that's missing. Now, with a repeated measures design, with the within group design, we have each participant being exposed to all levels of the independent variable. So remember what the study actually looked like was they tasted the chocolate alone, they rated the chocolate. They tasted the chocolate with a confederate, and they rated the chocolate. We don't have that with our one group pretest post-test design. We are measuring them, we're giving them a treatment, and we're measuring them again, but we only have one level of the treatment. So you might be thinking, okay, well, maybe this looks like an independent groups design. It kind of looks like the pretest post-test design, but remember with the pretest post-test design, we had two groups of participants. So this is another example. We didn't talk about this example in any of our video lectures, but I know that this is mentioned in the book. So let's imagine that a researcher was interested in manipulations that might help students improve their graduate record exam scores, GRE scores. And if you're not familiar with the GRE, it's the equivalent for graduate school of the SAT. It's a standardized test that some schools require before individuals are admitted to graduate school. So in this basic design, we have participants, they're randomly assigned to have their GREs to different groups. But first they have their GRE scores collected, either verbal on their verbal GRE scores, and we want to compare them at the beginning to make sure that their scores are about the same. Then one group of participants receives a mindfulness class and they are tested again. Another group of participants receives a nutrition class and their GRE scores are compared again. So this is a little bit different design, right? It's pretest, post-test, but we have two groups. We have an independent variable, the class that they received, either a mindfulness class or a nutrition class. And we do have post-test and pretest scores, but we have data collected for two different groups. In our one group, pretest, post-test design, we don't have that second group. We have a treatment, but we don't have a comparison. What is it being compared to? So this particular design, this one group pretest post-test design, lets us look at 6 different internal validity threats. Now, some of these are specific to this kind of a design, and so you might be thinking, well, I just won't do that kind of a design. But they are important to be thinking about for any kind of a research study. Additionally, it's important to keep in mind that these threats often don't happen in isolation. So you might have within the context of a study multiple threats happening. So, two or more threats could be happening at the same time, and all of them are going to affect our ability to determine if our independent variable, what we manipulated, what we changed, had an effect on the dependent variable. So, let's think about some of these. So, the first threat to internal validity that we're going to discuss is called a maturation threat. And I think for a lot of these things, it's easy to remember what they are because they sound like what they are. With maturation, think about somebody maturing. Across time, they are changing their behavior. And essentially, that's what maturation is. Maturation is kind of a natural change in a participant's behavior or thinking just based on time passing. All right, so we have these kids that were being measured in terms of their rambunctious behavior. And at the beginning of the week, we have what their rambunctious behavior was. We've manipulated their sugar, if we are the researcher in the study, and we're assessing them at the end of the week. So in the short term, maturation threats could be anything that happens again across time, but participants could get bored, they could get tired of participating within a study. Long term, if we're really looking at like perhaps even longitudinal research, not the example here with rambunctious behavior, if we're measuring people across time, they get older, they get wiser, they get more mature. They just change. If you think about yourself within the course of a term, if I measured you at the beginning of the term and I measured you at the end of the term, which is kind of what we're doing with that psych assessment, you're learning about psychology content, but you're also changing in other ways. And those other things that you are changing on, those other variables, could also influence performance. So, getting back to our example of the campers here, what else could be going on in this week besides the sugar? Well, across time, campers could be settling down more. They could have been assessed at the very beginning of when they were coming to camp, and maybe just across the course of the week, they get more settled into the routine of the camp. They might be more physically exhausted from the camp activities. They might be canoeing, they might be running, they might be swimming. And so that might influence their rambunctious behavior. They might have a better understanding of the rules of the camp. So these are all maturation threats. So with maturation, the participants are just changing because of time, and that has nothing to do with the sugar that they're being exposed to. So how do we prevent this? Well, as you might be noticing from what we talked about with the pretest post-test design, looking at an independent group design, we really need a comparison group. For the purposes here, we just are measuring one group at the beginning and at the end of the week. And this group, if we really needed, if we had that comparison, this other group would not have a change in sugar. So their results might look something like this. If we were measuring a second group of campers that didn't receive any change in their sugar and their rambunctious behavior just kept at the same level across time, we would have a better sense. If we had data that looked something like this, we would have a better sense that, you know what, the sugar really had an impact because look, we see a change here. They started at the same place, but this orange group, this is our control group for the purposes of this example, their behavior didn't change. But without that comparison group, we have no idea. All right, a second threat to internal validity has to do with history. Now, with history, some external or historical event is occurring that affects the participants at the same time as the treatment. Um, this isn't about the people, which was maturation. This is really about something else is happening, and that happens from the beginning of the week to the end of the week, and that also brings down their behavior. So, for our example here, what else could be happening at the camp that also influences rambunctious behavior? Well, perhaps there was some kind of an accident at the camp. Not one of the campers that's part of this study, but some other camper had some kind of an accident. That might affect the mood. Let's say there's been a dramatic change in the weather across the week of the camp. Either there was tremendous rain or perhaps it was incredibly hot. That dramatic change in the weather could also be affecting the rambunctious behavior of the campers. It's not something about the campers, but something else that's happening external to the manipulation of sugar that's also changing their behavior from the beginning to the end of the week. All right, so that's for our example. Now, if we're thinking about other kinds of research beyond our example here, COVID presents a wonderful example of how this could be happening in multiple research projects right now. Any researcher that is engaged in data collection or any data collection that's happening with participants across time has to be thinking about how COVID influences the responses of participants. If a researcher was collecting data in early 2020 and they started before COVID and then after all the changes to COVID, that would obviously have a dramatic impact on how participants were engaging within the study. Or if anything has happened, I mean, if there's a school shooting that occurs between the beginning of data collection to the end of data collection, obviously that's going to influence performance on one of the variables. So with history, we don't know, but we always have to assume or wonder if any kind of an external event can impact participants. Now, I've mentioned some things here that might be, somewhat negative in nature, but it could also be something very positive. Something really good could occur. But any kind of an event like that could also impact participants. And again, we don't know because in this design, one group pretest, post-test, we only have one group. So preventing this from happening, again, we need a comparison group. If we have a source of comparison, a group that isn't getting sugar, as in our example right here, we might be able to tell if some other historical event, some external event is also influencing what's going on for the campers. So if we are collecting data on another group, and again, I've put them in orange here, this is the group that doesn't get the change in sugar, and their behavior is also changing. That leads us to believe that maybe something else was going on. It wasn't the sugar, but something else was going on that changed their rambunctiousness. Okay, a third threat to internal validity has to do with regression. And it's called regression, but it's also referred to as regression to the mean. So we're going to be using a different example for considering this. With regression to the mean, essentially what that means is scores just tend to change across time. Extreme scores become less extreme. So they get closer to the mean. If you've taken any kind of math courses, you probably understand what a mean is. We add up all of the scores, we divide by the number of scores, and the mean is the average. So extreme scores tend to become more like the average scores across time. So low scores tend to get higher because the mean is going to be higher, and high scores tend to get lower. So scores get closer to the mean across time. So if we have this idea of the depression study, right? Remember the researcher who wants to expose women to cognitive therapy. If we have their depression scores before therapy and their depression scores after therapy, perhaps pre-therapy, we had some really high scores, and those are going to get closer to the mean, and they would have naturally gone down across time. But again, we don't know that because we don't have a source of comparison. So again, a lot of the ideas for preventing this has to do with the need for having a comparison group. We really can't just have one group. We need two groups, pre-test, post-test. And if we have this comparison group, we can look to see, did scores just naturally regress to the mean, get closer to the mean across time, even without the intervention? So we have two different graphs down here at the bottom. In the first graph down here at the bottom, we've got a lighter blue line, and this is our comparison group. We have it for both of them. But what we need with a one group pretest post-test design to really compare this is we need to look at the pretest scores, and we want the pretest scores to be about the same, right? We don't want one group to be different from the other group ahead of time. So we see in the first group here, we have the first graph, we have the pretest scores being about the same. This is the group that doesn't get therapy. This is the group that does. Now, if their post-test scores look different, it tells us that the independent variable had some sort of an impact. All right. And so we've got the first graph here where regression to the mean is not likely because this group, it did go down, but it didn't go down as dramatically as the group that received the therapy. This would suggest to us they started at the same place, but there are differences in where they ended. That makes us think that this is probably not an example of regression. Now we have this other example over here, and the groups are starting out pretty different to begin with. Now, if we used random assignment, we shouldn't see this happening, right? The group should be about the same. But if they are starting out to be very different at the beginning, and then at the end, um, the groups are pretty similar, this is suggesting to us that it's not therapy that's changing anything, right? It's just that this one group, the therapy group, was very extreme and they're getting closer to the mean. The group that is serving as the control group, the no therapy group, they're really similar. They're not changing across time, but the therapy group is scores are getting closer to the mean, so that regression is probably likely here. So put another way, the therapy isn't what's changing the um, the experimental group in this particular study. It's just that their scores are becoming less extreme. Another example of an internal validity threat has to do with attrition. So let's talk a little bit about what attrition means. Attrition means that in any study, people drop out. If we are using a one group pretest post test design, um, that really can affect the way that we look at our results. So if extreme scores drop, that's going to, and they drop from the beginning to the end, we're going to see a change, but it really has nothing to do with the sugar. It just is because extreme scores went away. So if somebody who has a really extreme scores drops out, it's going to look like there's been a big impact on the dependent variable when in fact it's just that some people dropped out. So if we imagine that at the beginning of the week we had a bunch of kids, but across the week some of the most rambunctious kids get kicked out, they leave the camp, or perhaps they decide they don't want to be there anymore, well, then these scores are going to go down, but it really has nothing to do with the sugar. It's just that the most extreme scores are not there anymore. Now, I want to emphasize that we're talking about things that affect a one group pretest post-test, but this can also occur in an independence group's design. Now, the second picture we have down here comes from some of the lectures from chapter 10. Remember when we were looking at the group of participants who were randomly assigned to take notes using a laptop or by hand with pen and paper, the longhand notes. And then we assess them on their comprehension tests. So this is not the same kind of a design. This is the two group. Well, this is actually just a post test design. But what we're looking at here is attrition can happen if one group of participants drops out more readily than another group of participants. So let's imagine participants who got assigned to that longhand group. They got more frustrated. If they dropped out of the study, then there might be some differences in their comprehension scores, but it really has nothing to do with if they were in the laptop group or the longhand notes group. But participants who might perform more poorly, I'm not comfortable doing notes longhand, so I'm going to be much more likely to drop out. That's going to mean that the people that are left in the longhand group might be students who are more used to taking longhand notes. And so there might be differences on the comprehension test just simply based on that. So attrition isn't something that just affects this one design, the one group pretest, post-test design, but attrition can affect participants in any kind of a study. Now, keep in mind, people are going to drop out. That just happens in research. But if people are dropping out of one group more so than another group, that that could affect your results. That could be a threat to validity. So how do we prevent this? Well, we do need a comparison group. As we mentioned, if we had a comparison group for our camping example here, we would at least know if some participants dropped out more so than others. The other option is if you're doing pretest, post-test, is if somebody drops out, you have to drop out their pretest score as well, because then that would at least show us that the most rambunctious kids, if their scores got dropped out from the beginning of the week, our scores at the beginning of the week wouldn't be quite. All right. A testing threat is another threat to internal validity. With a testing threat, we have order effects. Now, we've already talked about order effects a little bit. And anytime we take an assessment or do something more than once, our answers are likely to change. We could either have practice effects where we get better. If we get tested on a math test or on a vocabulary test, doing it more than once, we're going to get better. Or we could have a fatigue effects where we're just doing something more than once and we get tired. Now, how do we prevent this? Well, again, we need a comparison group to see if they're changing in terms of practice effects or fatigue effects, and that has nothing to do with the independent variable. Another option is we could use an alternative form of the test. Sometimes just taking a test more than once, especially if it's in a short period of time, um, we're going to change our responses just because we know, oh, I remember I just took that a second ago. I want to look a little bit different. So we could use a different form of the test. Um, but if we do, we have to make sure that the forms are equivalent. So for example, if I am interested in if media images influence body self-esteem, and I present my participants with media images, if I assess their self-esteem first, and then present them with media images. The second time I assess them with their body self-esteem and I use a different scale, they're not as likely to be showing practice effects or fatigue effects. If I use the same scale twice, they might change their responses simply because they're seeing the questions a second time. All right, the last threat to internal validity we're going to discuss today has to do with instrumentation threat. And it's also called experimenter drift. What this threat means is that the device, the scale, or the person doing the measurements changes across time. So if, for example, I am collecting information on weight and my scale gets less sensitive across time, that I might see changes in the responses of my participants, but it really has nothing to do with my participants changing. It really has to do with the scale that I am using being less sensitive. So if any kind of device that I'm using becomes less sensitive across time, it could be a scale, it could be a stopwatch, it could be anything I'm using to measure my participants. If it gets less sensitive, then that is a threat to my study, but it has nothing to do with my participants changing on their own. Or if I'm using a different measurement because I'm really worrying about avoiding testing threats, the scales might be too different. So if I'm using different tests, a minute ago I mentioned self-esteem, self-body image. If they really are not measuring the same thing, I'm going to have an instrumentation threat here. Or it's possible the researcher changes across time. The researcher becomes more or less accurate across time. I think we use this example in class. If I'm testing participants in person and the very first participant, I'm reading the script very carefully. I'm answering all their questions in detail. I'm very, very careful. But by the time I've tested participant number 100, I might be skipping through some of the content in the consent process. I might be reading through the script very quickly. Um, if I change across time, that can potentially influence my dependent variable. So the researcher could either become more or less accurate across time in the way they interact with participants and the way that they score the instruments themselves. And this is all going to influence the data that we collect. So how do we prevent this? Well, one option is to just use the post-test only design. That would be the example we used a few minutes ago with the participants being exposed to the laptop or the longhand notes and seeing what that looks like. If we're not testing them more than once, we're not going to be as likely to see that instrumentation threat. Or we just have to make sure the device or person that's doing the measurement does not change. And we need to do what are called reliability checks. We might have more than one person that's assessing, um, interacting with the participants, or we have more than one person that's checking the scores of participants and they're not working together just to make sure that they agree with what's happening within the study. All right, now we're going to take a break and we're going to come back and talk about additional threats to